The sky here stopped pretending to be weather a long time ago. It hangs like a bruise, a constant low-iron sun that never clears. Some days it's a grinding, yellow glare that bakes the ground until dust cigarettes fall from the cracked asphalt. Other days it's a choking, ash gray that makes you cough before you even open your mouth. I measure time not in hours, but in how the light lies across the shell-pocked buildings. A thin, sickly wash that tells me whether a patrol can move or if the wind will carry the next blast of grit. Bakhmut used to be a place with streets and names you could say aloud. Now those names fold into the landscape. Intersections are hollows, monuments are scaffolds of rebar and memory. Factories sag like old beasts. The river that once stitched the city together is a belly of mud and broken reeds. Its banks eaten away by cycles of flood and drought that the maps never accounted for. Where there was a main square and a market, there is a cratered plain where scavengers set up lean-tos and children learn the geometry of fear. The climate didn't just change, it rearranged our lives. Winters bite deeper than before, thin, treacherous ice that hides sinkholes and poisoned runoff. Summers arrive like sieges, heat waves that coil over the fields and strip the color out of everything living. Fires sweep through the outer villages now with a speed that makes men pray to things they don't believe in. Rain comes in curses, either a cloudless 6 months that makes wells surrender, or a single violent hour that turns streets into rivers of greasy brown and drags with it whatever hope was still clinging to the foundations. The air tastes metallic. Sometimes it tastes like old metal and oil, sometimes like the burnt paper of a family album. I still wake to its smell, the acrid, rusty tang that means the world is shifting again. Dust settles on everything, a fine gray veil that coats the remnants of our lives and makes them anonymous. You can cover a photograph with dust, and then it becomes a different picture entirely. Governments have the shape of old promises here. Administration buildings stand like hollow teeth. Offices are emptied of forms and laughter. There are still flags sometimes, hung crooked from ruined balconies, but they dry out and fray faster than anyone can rally behind them. Authority splintered the way roads do under too much sun. Into cracks people can fall through. In the gaps, pockets of order rise and fall with the seasons. Small councils form around heat sources, around wells, around fortified cellars where people barter warmth for information. Survivor groups are the new institutions. Some call themselves brigades, others call themselves companies, but most are just people with a plan and a willingness to do what others will not. There are those who try to keep records, names, births, the little triumphs that make life tolerable, and there are those who trade in what's left of our past. Old radios, batteries, the occasional preserved can of fruit. Scavengers move like ghosts between the ruins, nimble and patient. They will take what you have and leave a mark on your wall as a warning, or sometimes as a sign of respect. You learn which marks mean danger and which mean someone else has shared water. Rogue factions prowl the edges. They are not always cruel in the way we mean it. Sometimes cruelty is simply scarcity made visible. They will demand tribute. They will claim stretch of road or pipe as if human law can be rerouted like water. We trade with some. We watch others through crosshairs and binoculars. Trust is currency rarer than anything sold in the markets that still breathe. Institutions that survived the early collapse are skeletal now. Hospitals keep a skeleton staff and a list of priorities. They patch and sterilize in rooms where the lights flicker, and they trade knowledge like contraband. Schools have been repurposed into distribution points or sleeping quarters. Churches and civic halls serve as both shelter and negotiation rooms. The university library, once a cathedral of learning, is now a field guide in slow motion. People come to forage for knowledge that might help build a filter or read a grainy manual on water reclamation and leave with their faces rearranged by a new kind of faith. Nature absurdly keeps its own schedule. Where buildings collapsed, grass tries to make a fist around the rubble. A stubborn sapling will push through concrete like a question. That resilience sits beside brutality. Life returns in small, stubborn ways while the larger systems that supported it fail. Birds still move between ruined roofs, and sometimes at dawn, you can hear a few of them arguing with the wind. Those sounds feel obscene and holy at the same time. We have learned to live with the sounds of broken things. The low, distant thud of artillery answering itself like a beast dreaming, the skitter of rats in the market stalls, the sharp whisper of men trading words for bullets. There is always the possibility of more, of a storm that takes the last tarp, of a chemical runoff that poisons the next well, of a fight that spills into the places we have made into home. Walking these streets, I carry memory as we carry water sparingly, guarded jealously, measured for the day. Memory is dangerous because it makes you long for more than survival, but it is also the scaffold of what we still call hope. Even here, amid the smell of burned oil and the taste of dust, hope persists in the shape of a shared cigarette, a half-fixed radio, a map with a circled river that might, just might, still run clean. I learned to count losses the way other people count their birthdays. By number, by name, by the small things that stop working and never come back. I used to keep my calendar on a wall, meetings, coffee with friends, a dentist appointment I never kept. Now I keep a list in my head. 3 radios I've fixed, 4 boots with mismatched soles, 2 teeth missing from a winter when food ran out, and the names that come up when I close my eyes. Counting keeps the shape of things. It keeps me from being swallowed by the roar of everything that ended. My name is recorded in a notebook that someone once left behind in the municipal archive, a loose-leaf page with ink that bled at the edges. On paper, I am something like an administrator, a former logistics officer who routed trucks and filled forms. On the ground, I am a runner, a medic, and sometimes a voice on a battered transmitter that croaks through the static at night. The radio is a small altar. I sit before it like a man at prayer. I patch a wire, tune the dial, and speak into a world that may or may not be listening. There is a strange intimacy in that, to speak, and to believe that someone will hear you. It is how I remind myself that I exist. Survival here is a ledger of small, repeated tasks. We ration everything because the future has become abstract and the present very sharp. Water is our ledger's top line. We haul it in jerry cans from an old filtration station 2 villages over, a place half buried but still breathing through the cracks. We run the water through cloth, through charcoal, through a makeshift sand filter. We learn to build from a library manual someone photocopied before the electricity failed. Sterilization is done by boiling, a 3-hour ritual that costs fuel and patience. When the river runs poisonous with runoff after a storm, we dig wells in the hollows where the old pipes lay like bones. Sometimes the water is sweet, sometimes it tastes like metal and the truth. Food is a negotiation. We have caches, tins traded one winter for 2 weeks of labor, sacks of grain that survived because a roof collapsed and smothered the rodents. We forage, dandelion leaves hidden beneath the brown of last season, mushrooms that we check twice before eating, roots that we roast on embers and pretend are a feast. I learned to recognize the plastic smell of a can that has been compromised. I learned the white bloom on bread that says don't eat it. Cooking is less about flavor and more about ceremony, a way to remind ourselves that we can still turn something raw into something sustaining. We trade favors for sugar, cigarettes for batteries. Trust is a currency with a short half-life. My hands tell the story that my face tries to forget. They are stained with soot, calloused from years of carrying sacks, and scarred from a door that closed on me when I was younger and thought I could outrun anything. I am a poor politician of my own pain. I hand out bandages with a competence I borrowed from old training. Clean the wound, stop the bleeding, stitch if you must, and then tell the person everything will be fine even when you do not believe it. People sleep better after you tell them a lie that comforts them. You are allowed small untruths when the world itself is a lie. What keeps me moving is not the abstract notion of duty, nor an illusion of heroism. It is the small, stubborn obligations that make me human. There is a girl, Lena, who sits by the corner where the market used to be and mends clothes with fingers that remember needlework from before. She once patched my sleeve without asking, and when I pressed a scrap of bread into her hand, she gave me a look that says the world can still be owed something. There is an old man we call Petrov who flashes the same joke every night despite his missing teeth. He collects batteries like treasures and shares the ones he cannot use. I keep a list of their smiles in a small pocket of my jacket. Those smiles are why I keep going. They are the thin thread that tethers me to tomorrow. Loss is a presence that sits heavy at the table. I speak of my family as if they are another country I visited once familiar, now foreign. There are photographs folded in my pack. A woman with hair like summer wheat, a child with a gap-toothed grin. I talk to them sometimes when the generator hums and I am alone. I tell them what I saw that day, who I traded for bulbs, which road is safer, how the light fell like glass on the broken bridge. Talking aloud is a ritual that keeps memory alive. The world took the people I loved in ways both sudden and slow. A house that stood the way houses stand, with memories in the walls, dissolved into an absence that no one can fill. Grief arrived not as one great wave, but as a series of small, precise losses. The smell of coffee gone, the sound of a laugh that mapped a day, the way a hand fit into mine. I am not untouched by anger. There are nights when the anger is a furnace, and I walk until my legs fail. I rage against those who took more than they needed, against those who let the leaks fester. Rage keeps you moving as long as you don't let it turn you into a thing that only takes. The thin line I walk is between protecting what we have and becoming someone who hoards it for the thrill of possession. When supplies are low, we argue, sometimes loudly and badly. I have made choices I regret. I once bartered a crate of antibiotics for a generator part because a child had fever and the hospital was a rumor. The generator fixed the radio that night, and someone listened. Ethics here live in shades of necessary cruelty. I try to teach how to knot a sling, how to spot water in a place that looks bone dry, how to mend a wound with the fewest tools. Teaching keeps hope practical. If I can make one person who can boil and filter, who can set a splint, who can barter, then I have multiplied the chances of someone else waking up tomorrow. I keep books folded into my pack, a field guide to plants, a dog-eared manual on engine repair, a child's primer that I read aloud sometimes because the sound of a voice stating facts anchors us to civility. There are scars that do not show. Sleep is a luxury I have been forced to monetize. I measure it in fits and starts, in the small hours when the world is loudest and the mind is most treacherous. I dream in fragments of a street that is all light, of a school where children run without fear, of a river clean enough to drink without rituals. I wake to the generator's cough and the smell of boiled cabbage, and I count my losses again. The ledger keeps me sane. Sometimes I speak into the radio not because I expect an answer, but because it is the only thing that keeps my voice from going inside and being swallowed. I offer coordinates, I list needs, I tell stories. I tell jokes that land with the static. I read lines from a book I found in the municipal library because they are nice lines, and because they remind me there was once a world invested in language. People respond rarely. A crackle, a name whispered, a distant laugh. The replies are like rain when you have been thirsty for months, unexpected, and so oddly reverent that you find yourself thanking the air. If there is a confession to be made, it is that hope is not a single bright thing. It is a series of small decisions to keep going, to risk for someone else, to share bread and knowledge and a cigarette. Hope is practical, bartering for a solar panel strip that will keep the lights on in the infirmary, walking a patrol route twice to ensure a small child can visit her mother, teaching someone how to boil and filter water. When I imagine the future, it is not a single triumphant scene. It is a ledger with more additions than subtractions. I do not pretend to be brave. Most days' bravery is an exhaustion you pull on like a heavy coat because the alternative is to feel every loss at once. I am tired, sometimes so tired that the radio's hum sounds like a hymn. But I have a map in my head, not of cities but of people. Who needs what, who can trade, who will laugh at a terrible joke. That map is more useful than any road on a paper map. It tells me where to go and why. When I speak into the night, when I send code through a wire and into the dark, I am asking for two things. For someone to hear, and for someone else to know they are not alone. That is my shame and my salvation. We survive not because we are prepared for the end, but because we are stubborn in the small kindnesses that answer it. They say crises arrive like a single thunderclap. That's a city fable. What we live through is different. It's a long, cunning collapse that eats at the edges first and then comes for everything you relied on. For us, the crisis began in seasons. A summer that never quit, a winter that came too sharp, a spring of floods that seemed to forget how to be gentle. It is a crisis written in the weather and in the slow rot of infrastructure, in the poisoned taste of water, and the way the ground no longer holds a promise for seed. The primary disaster is not a single thing. It is a braided problem, climate collapse braided with war and broken supply lines. The skies cook the land in one breath, and then we are drowned in another. Rain has become a weapon by accident. When it falls, it comes down so hard it strips topsoil and sends chemical sludge from broken tanks down into the riverbeds. When it doesn't fall, wells dry to the sound of a hand scraping glass. The oscillation between drought and deluge is what kills people's plans. Crops fail not because of a single frost or a single insect, but because the rhythms we counted on, the slow, dependable turning of seasons, have been amputated. On top of that, war has shredded the plumbing. Pipelines that moved water, treatment plants that once scrubbed it clean, the electrical grids that powered pumps and heaters. These things are now maps of absence. Shelling collapses a distribution hub, and 100,000 liters of clean water either spill into the ground or become contaminated by whatever was in the trenches. A strike at a chemical storehouse sends toxins into the watershed and changes a village's well into a death trap overnight. Engineers used to say redundancy and fail-safe like charms. In our world, redundancy is a memory. Everyday survival becomes harder because the environmental baselines we relied on have shifted, and because human systems that repaired and redistributed resources have fractured. Fuel is one axis of collapse. Without fuel, pumps stop, heat is rationed, and people die in winter. Food supply lines are long and brittle. A damaged bridge can turn months of planning into dust. Medical supplies are unpredictable. Antibiotics become rarities you hide in tinned cans. Money is less useful than a working generator, a bag of grain, or a safe place to sleep. What used to be public goods, water, power, vaccines, now depend on local fortunes and the mercy of whoever controls the road. The social consequences are catastrophic in mundane ways. Hospitals keep triage lists that read like manifestos of impossible choices. Who must be treated and who is left for palliative comfort. Schools close and their classrooms become food distribution centers or sleeping berths. Administrative centers are skeletons. Where once a mayor might convene a council, now a small group of elders meet to ration coal. That small group's decisions are life and death in a directness that politician speak never prepared anyone for. We are short on everything that matters. Clean water, stored food, fuel, medical supplies, batteries, and spare parts. Even knowledge has become scarce, not because books disappeared, but because the tools to put knowledge into practice, clean labs, functioning labs, stable power are gone. Where once a city had a network of technicians who fixed pumps and kept sewage away from drinking water, now we have a handful of people with hands that remember how to splice a pipe, and the rest of us learning by watching until someone dies, and we learn what to avoid. Encounters with other survivors sharpen the crisis into moral geometry. Some groups arrive as allies, farmers who kept a bit of seed or a small functioning borehole. engineers sent by a ragtag NGO to repair a water pump, medics who still believe in triage and hygiene. They are miracles, and they make the community breathe easier for a while. They bring knowledge: how to convert a diesel pump to a manual, how to set up a microfiltration rig, how to build composting latrines that do not spread disease. We trade what we have: labor for expertise, blankets for sewn cloth filters, stories for the knowledge of where the next shipment may appear. But other encounters are violent and ugly. Raiders, men and women who have decided that the best way to survive is to prowl the roads. Some are organized like small battalions. Others are loose gangs who move at night. They do not always steal because they hate us. Often they steal because their own children are hungry, and the easy calculus of violence won them a tin of condensed milk. That doesn't make it less brutal. A convoy that once came weekly now comes when it can, and sometimes it doesn't come at all because a checkpoint has been taken or a bridge destroyed. In those gaps, the raiders and the fearful fight for the scraps the world still offers. One long night I watched a small group of our people fend off 3 men who came for the water barrels. They had learned to be more frightening than the need itself. They had faces that seemed more tired than hungry. We fired warning shots. Shots were answered. In the end, a boy named Misha lost a hand. We wrapped what we could and carried Misha to Petrov, who murmured a joke and counted batteries instead of tears. Trauma becomes a currency, too. You trade in wounds, in nights awake, in the way you can no longer let a child out of your sight. The weather itself turns predatory. Huge dust storms now come with a speed that steals breath. When they arrive, you shelter and pray the tarp holds. The storms pick up chemical residues and shrapnel, and they leave a film over everything, a grimy coating that poisons food when left, scratches lenses and clogs filters. Then, when the sky relents, the rare rain comes down in violent sheets that wash away topsoil and leave behind a stew of rust and fertilizer, and whatever sank into the earth when the tanks rolled by. During one of those floods, the old filtration plant we relied on, half rebuilt by volunteers, was overwhelmed. A week later, half the households had gastrointestinal infections. Someone died who might have lived with working infrastructure. Why does survival get harder every day? Because the feedback loops are accelerating. Heat increases evaporation, drying the soil and lowering river flow. Lower river flows concentrate pollutants and salt. Low soil moisture means plants are weaker and more vulnerable to pests. Damaged crops mean less food and less fodder for livestock. Fewer livestock means fewer inputs for fertilizer and less power for hauling things. War damages repair crews and transportation. Damaged governance means there is no centrally organized response. Scarcity breeds theft and violence. Violence breaks the remaining supply lines. Broken supply lines lead to more scarcity. It is a spiral where each turn feeds the next. There is a practical science behind much of what we live through, and I try to explain it to anyone who will listen, because knowledge saves more lives than hope alone. War and climate together increase the variance in rainfall. Instead of a slow, measurable curve of moisture, you get sharp peaks and long troughs. Intense rainfall occurs because a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. When that moisture releases, it does so violently. Meanwhile, persistent heat increases surface evaporation rates and dries out the organic layer that holds water in the soil. With less retention, rain runs off instead of soaking in, amplifying floods and starvation of the ground simultaneously. A few actionable things matter more than speeches. First, water. You can survive on little if that little is clean. We build layered filters when we can, a cloth to catch large particles, then layers of gravel, sand, and charcoal in a container with a fine cloth at the bottom. Charcoal is not magic, but it adsorbs odors and some chemicals. The filter will make cloudy water look better and remove particulates. It will not remove dissolved toxins like heavy metals or industrial solvents. For those, boiling won't help either. Heating can kill microbes, but does not remove metals. Boiling is essential for biological contamination. Bring water to a rolling boil for 1 minute at low elevations, 3 minutes if you are above 2,000 meters. If you have access to solar stills, a shallow basin, a sheet of clear plastic, a collection cup, you can distill water, which removes most contaminants but yields small amounts and requires time. Second, storage and rationing. Store water in opaque containers away from sunlight to prevent algae growth. Rotate stocks so that older water is used first. Keep water covered. Even a single uncovered barrel can turn into a mosquito nursery and a disease vector. For food, prioritize caloric density and nutritional value. Dried legumes, fats, and preserved vegetables last longer and maintain strength. Learn to ferment and pickle. These methods preserve food without constant heat. Third, hygiene and disease control. Even rudimentary hand washing with soap has a disproportionate effect on health outcomes. If soap is scarce, ash and sand mixed with water can serve in a pinch, but soap is best. Separate clean water for drinking from water used for washing if you can. A simple latrine, dug away from water sources and covered, reduces contaminating runoff. Fourth, energy. Conserve fuel and shift to renewables where possible. Small solar panels, even a single panel, can power a radio or charge a battery. Strip wiring from dead cars. Copper is valuable, but mind the risk of cutting shortcuts that cause fires. Learn to maintain a generator. Clean air filters, check oil, and run it on the lightest load. Every liter of fuel is precious. Use it to boil water and power critical devices, not to heat empty rooms. Fifth, social organization. Create watch rotations, not just for security but for resource management. Keep a log. Who borrowed what, who owes what, and what went out of the communal stores. A community ledger is both a logistical tool and a moral one. It cultivates accountability. Teach others basic skills, how to splice a hose, how to set a splint, how to tell if canned food is compromised, because multiplying competence multiplies survival. Those are the practical pieces. But there is also an unglamorous psychological reality. Morale is a resource. Feeding it is as strategic as filling a tank. Stories matter. So does fairness in distribution. When leaders on our block hoard supplies or favor their kin, people break apart and violence follows. We try to be lucid about trade-offs and to rotate responsibility so no one becomes the permanent scapegoat. The limits are stubborn and personal. We have one pump that works intermittently. Half our people must carry water across 2 ruined blocks. We have a list of names for people who must be prioritized for antibiotics. That list grows. The solar panels someone gave us last winter are now stored under a tarpaulin. 3 cells failed last month and we cannot find replacements. Each missing thing is a small cliff. And then there is the rumor. Always the rumor in these times of a functioning reservoir 200 kilometers to the north. A place where the engineers are said to have rigged a solar-powered lift and clear spring water pools like mirrors. The rumor becomes a decision point. Send a team and risk a convoy, or stay and become the village that kept its people safe but slowly starved. Or send someone small and hope they can return with proof. I listen to the radio, to static and to voices, and I weigh the arithmetic of risk against the arithmetic of need. We are not waiting for rescue. We are improvising a rescue of ourselves from the rubble. Rerouting pipes, teaching water knowledge, planting drought-resistant crops, building contour ridges to hold rain. Some of the things we do are tiny and stubborn, and against odds work. We salvage a pump, we teach a child to boil, we trade a battery for a set of spare gaskets. The crisis is not a single beast, it is many small threats that chew at the margins. Our survival comes in small victories. A repaired filter, a night without gunfire, a laugh shared between raids. But urgency is constant. Each season could be the one that breaks us. Each battle could cut the last line to a clinic. So we plan in increments a week, a month, a summer, and hold to the people whose names are stitched into our pockets. Lena mends sleeves, Petrov counts batteries and makes the worst jokes. I keep talking into the radio because voices stitch people together. In the end, the crisis is a test of whether a scattered chorus of people will make noise loud enough to be heard above the storms. We are trying to sing. They say pressure reveals the shape of things. Lately, pressure is all we have: a pressure from the weather, pressure from hunger, pressure from people whose patience is a rubber band pulled thin. The air has a way of pressing in, making the ribs feel like cages. You learn to breathe around it. Water that used to be a dull, steady hum at the center of life has become a rumor and a debt. The barrels we kept behind the school are down to 3, and one of those leaked last week when a scavenger kicked the wrong pallet in the dark. We patched it with cloth and resin, and for a day the patched barrel gave us a false sense of abundance. The next morning the patch had come loose, and we learned the true weight of optimism. We ration now in half measures and in small rites. A cup of boiled tea shared between 3 people in the morning, a spoonful of broth for someone convalescing, an extra sip for the child who says please with an old, polite voice. Ritual matters. It makes scarcity dignified. We are running out of fuel. The generator in the infirmary coughs and breathes in fits, consuming its last reserves like a man counting his last cigarettes. Fuel is not just warmth. It is light for reading casts, power for the centrifuge that spins blood samples, and heat to make sterile the one scalpel we have left. We have tried everything. Scavenged jerry cans from burnt convoys, siphoned what we could from abandoned vehicles, attempted crude biofuels from pressed seed. The yields are poor and the smell is terrible, but sometimes it is enough to run the lights for a night so a child can sleep. Fuel scarcity forces choices. Do you run the generator for the clinic or for the radio? The radio keeps the network of rumor and help alive. The clinic keeps children alive. We argue. We vote. We lose. Food is dwindling to the edges. The cache in the bakery, tins of condensed milk and jars of fruit someone had stowed away, is half empty. Rats took one of the sacks of grain because the roof leak let them in. I remember the cold, methodical way we wrapped the remaining sacks in plastic and buried them under crates, like burying something alive to keep it from the world. We are learning to eat differently. Legumes more often for protein and calories. Greens when we can find them that haven't been scorched. River fish when the filtration holds. The little greenhouse we keep in the municipal library courtyard is more fragile than any relationship I've cultivated. It provides herbs and the occasional tomato, but its plastic skin is weathered, and every wind threatens to rip our small miracle apart. The raiders have grown more organized. Before, they were opportunists, silhouettes that moved through the night and took goods with the ruthless efficiency of hunger. Now, they strike like units. They come with stolen insignia, and the arrogance of survival turned into profession. They took 2 of our scouts last month, men who went out to repair the pump at dawn and never returned. We found their backpacks later, slashed open and empty, and Misha was meaner for the loss. He took to walking the perimeter with a rifle and a glare that could split wood. People sleep less when grief sharpens into guard duty. We traded once with a group that called themselves the Northward Guild. They had maps and parts, and a solar panel they were willing to trade for antibiotics and labor. We bartered. We taught one man to splice wire, and he taught us to fix diodes. For a few weeks we had a flicker of light at the community center that lasted past curfew. It felt like a small stolen sun. Then one night the guild took more than they'd bargained for, a crate of canned meat, and left behind a promise that tasted like ash. The trust broke like glass. That betrayal changed how we met outsiders, with open hands and hidden knives. Rumors tattoo the radios, whispers of a reservoir, murmurs of a community to the north that has water that tastes like childhood. We had the rumor before, of course. Every desperation births a myth, but this was different. A name kept coming up on the frequency. Kamenka. A woman in a broken city 2 towns over swore she listened to a broadcast where someone with a lilt in their voice described a reservoir with a solar lift, and a line of windmills that turned when the sun was hungry. The description was contradictory and beautiful. It might be true. It might be a story someone told to keep themselves from going quiet. The problem with rumors in this time is you can build lives around them as easily as you can build traps. If Kamenka exists and we send a team and it is true, we become water-rich and can trade our way to a semblance of stability. If it isn't, and we send a team and they do not return, we become poorer in human terms than we were before. The ledger of our survival records losses not just in tins of beans, but in feet, in hands, in the small capacities of people to keep watching over each other. The idea of sending scouts transforms into a moral calculus I had not expected to weigh so often. Lena argues for faith in the rumor. She is practical about it. We must choose between a caravan and a coffin, she said once, snapping thread through a sleeve. Petrov grumbled and counted batteries. I kept listening on the radio, parsing the static for more names, more coordinates, anything that would let us measure the rumor instead of worship it. We decided to send two, a small pair that could move quietly, with a radio and a Camel battery pack that might stand 3 days of continuous use. Misha wanted to go. He wanted to take the world back with brute force. I chose Sergei because he could move like a ghost and not think himself invincible. We filled his pack with water, with bandages, with a map and a note that said, "If you find Kamenka, return with proof. Bring no promises. Trust fractures quickly." There was a night when the market man, a quiet woman who had kept the bakery going until a shell took the oven, accused Petrov of hoarding batteries. Petrov swore he had not, but the accusation hung like a bad thought. Under the pressure of scarcity, accusations are quick and slurred. Someone always assumes the worst. To keep peace, we instituted a ledger, and 2 volunteers recorded every exchange like monks tallying alms. The ledger worked for a week. Then the ledger's book disappeared. We found it days later, burned on a brazier behind the infirmary. Someone had decided secrets were safer in ash. And then the weather began to play with us like a cat batting at a trapped mouse. A wind came from the south that smelled wrong, metallic and salty, like a place where tanks had rolled and left their waste. It stripped doors off hinges and left the air full of a static that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The dust storm hit at dawn, and we lost 2 tarps and half the greenhouse plastic. The storm carried shards of something, possibly broken glass or the flakes of oxidized metal, and when it settled, everything that had been left bare had a new, fine rust over it. We found contaminated puddles near the old chemical depot. Children had been playing in the runoff, and a week later they were sick. The clinic's triage list grew by 3 names. The assault on our morale has been gradual and cunning. There are small victories, a fish caught, a broken diode fixed, a field of potatoes that survived a blight, and they are followed almost immediately by losses that reframe those victories as temporary. You learn to celebrate quietly. The louder your joy, the louder the world is allowed to take it. Inside me there is a tug of war. I want to trust. I want to believe in Kamenka and in human goodness, but I also know the math of scarcity. There are only so many calories you can trade for a battery. There are only so many people who can make a repair job and only so many hours in which to sleep. Hope is a tightrope and skepticism is a safety net, but sometimes the net's weave comes apart and you fall through. One night Sergei returned. He came after a week and a day, a paper-skin shell of a man who smelled of cold and river and something that almost looked like promise. He had no triumphant smile. He had a map with a scrawl of coordinates and a tiny shard of the clear plastic used for solar stills. He said Kamenka was real in the way a man says the sea is big. It is not a promise so much as an observation. He told us of a community that had a levee and a pump house and a ring of people who had learned to barter. They had 3 turbines that turned in a breeze and a cistern that held water guarded by watchmen with names. That night we breathed as if for the first time in a month. But relief is a complicated thing. Sergei's story came with a weight. The route to Kamenka crosses a stretch of road known for ambushes and passes near a cluster of towns now run by a faction that does not like strangers. The water would not be free. It would need negotiation, labor, maybe force. We could send a delegation to negotiate terms. We could try to take the reservoir by force. Each option had its ration of risk and moral cost. The inner argument is not abstract. I remember a mother in the market with her child sleeping on her lap. I remember the old man whose cough had gotten worse. I remember a schoolroom where 12 children had learned to count with wooden blocks and now use the same room to heat soup. Deciding whether to risk sending 15 people to negotiate for water is deciding whether you are willing to gamble those faces for a chance at abundance. It is the kind of decision that weighs the size of one life against the needs of many, and there are no algorithms for it, only the slow arithmetic of a conscience. We begin preparations. We mend boots, pack radios, assemble rations. The caravan we form is small by design, stealth over force, speed over spectacle. I draw a route that skirts known danger zones. I call on a map I keep in my head carved from conversations and the shreds of a road atlas. We load in silence and with the clumsy etiquette of people who know the possible finality of their task. Night before departure, we gather. People bring small things for luck. A coin that is actually a flattened washer, a yellow ribbon from someone's hair, a plate that once had a child's initials scratched into the back. Lena stitches a ribbon into my coat and says, "Bring rain or return with the map." Petrov hands me a battery and says, "Don't spend it on ghosts." Misha slaps my shoulder hard enough to bruise and says nothing, because he has learned that words sometimes invite the wrong thing. We leave before dawn when the air is still half dark and the dust sleeps. The town drowses in its low, watchful way. We move like people who know how to be small and careful. The road opens and closes like a throat. Each kilometer is a question. Each bend hides a possible decision. We carry not only supplies but the fragile ledger of trust the community placed in us. If we fail, the ledger will be returned to blank pages and the trust will be harder to light again. The rising action is not a single thing. It is a series of small escalations. The storm has torn the greenhouse. The scavengers have learned to move in units. Food runs low and the radios hum with rumors. The promise of Kamenka is both a horizon and a knife. Inside me, I feel the knot of duty and doubt tighten. We are moving towards something that may save us, or it may be the last mistake we make together. Either way, the road is what we have, and we walk it. They called it Kamenka like a prayer, a small, strange word that sounded like a place that might still keep its vowels. When we first saw it, after a day of road that smelled of scorched rubber and old diesel, it looked like an impossible thing. A ring of windmills caught in a pale, steady wind, a low wall of sandbags and scavenged concrete, and behind it a gleam of water that did not belong to the landscape around it. The cistern held the color of old glass. The surface was flat as a mirror, and for a moment I could not think of anything but that impossible reflection. Approach was careful. Sergei moved like someone who had learned to wear silence as armor. Misha was taught as piano wire and walked the flank with a rifle that weighed less because of his will. We skirted the outer scrub and watched the watchmen. Kamenka was not some open oasis where travelers could waltz in. It was a guarded economy, a little town that had learned the art of being small and valuable. Men and women were posted on towers built of shipping pallets and rebar, speaking into radios with a precision that said, "We have survived practice at this." The leaders came down to meet us. They were older than I expected and careful in their politeness. They smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and strong tea. Their eyes measured us like a ledger. How many, what we carried, and whether our boots had the dust of desperation stamped into them. Negotiations began like bartering at a market, offers, counters, a pause to regard a man's hands for honesty. They wanted labor, minds that could keep pumps going and bodies to reinforce the levee. They wanted a percentage of our stores for a year of access. It was not a robbery dressed as governance. It was a bargain whose terms were carved by necessity. I offered what I could: knowledge, an ability to read a pump's heart, a promise to teach whoever they chose how to maintain turbine bearings and splice electrical connections. I offered Sergei as a transient mechanic who could travel back and forth if he survived. The leader, a woman with hair cropped to a stubble and a scar that ran like an old map across her cheek, listened and then made the hard ask. One of us must stay as a liaison, someone trusted to be in Kamenka, to tend its systems and pass back knowledge. The rest could go with a rationed allotment of water. It was a fair calculus from their point of view. From our point of view, it felt like a possible fracture. Before we could answer, the sky changed. It was the kind of change that announces itself with a wrongness. The light went thin, and a wind came off the north that smelled of metal and rot. The watchman on the palisade cursed and pointed toward the lowlands. A convoy of smoke curls rose from the horizon where nothing should be burning. Someone shouted that the old chemical depot, a place we had been warned about on maps and in radio murmurs, had been struck. We felt the effect before we saw the rest. The wind carried a fine, metallic dust and an oily tang that sat heavy on the tongue. Kamenka moved with the efficiency of a community that had practiced emergency. Alarms sounded, the windmills were feathered, and people began the slow choreography of closing tarps and sealing pumps. The leader barked orders in a language of function: move the children to the inner quad, secure the cistern vents, start the overflow protocol. We helped where we could, because there are tasks that look the same no matter which flag you fly. Push sandbags, roll plastic sheeting, form human shields around fragile valves. That winter of the world had taught us many things, the least of which was how to be calm while the planet misbehaved. But there was also another movement. Figures moving fast toward Kamenka along the ridge, the silhouettes of men riding on an old flatbed truck with something like bravado in their shoulders. They were raiders, or so they looked, and they came with the certainty of people who had decided that other people's water was the only reliable way to keep their own children alive. They carried long guns and longer faces. Negotiations dissolved into a different math. The raiders wanted access to the cistern and offered the old calculus of force. Kamenka's leader tried to parley. She had the kind of voice that could make someone believe in an economy of reason for a minute. She promised trade, work, and a portion if they helped repair the levee. The raiders laughed like something breaking. One of them spat on the ground as if daring the town to react. The air smelled of petrol, of wire insulation, of wet metal. Then the pumps shuddered and died. No single thing caused it. The pump house buckled under multiple strikes. Sludge, sediment, and a film of something oily had chewed the bearings. An electrical surge from damaged wiring blew the starter. Someone later described it as the world rearranging itself in the span of a breath. A strike upstream had mixed coolant and solvents into runoff that found its way into the intake. The motor overheated. The control boards fritzed, and a thin sheen of pollution layered the cistern like an invisible skin. People screamed, not only for water but for calculation. Now we had to decide how to keep people alive without the machine that had been their heart. The raiders smelled weakness and advanced. Kamenka tightened and drew lines on the sand. Men lined up with rifles, and there was a moment where the world seemed to measure itself in two kinds of courage: the courage to take and the courage to hold. I remember looking at Sergei and then at Misha. I remember the ledger of faces we had carried with us. The woman who ran the bakery, the child who slept on her mother's lap, Petrov counting batteries like talismans. The decision did not feel like a plan. It felt like the exact center of ethics and survival pressing through bone. The leader asked for volunteers to enter the pump house and assess the damage. I stepped forward. It was as automatic as prayer. You learn quickly here that the most valuable thing you can offer is competence combined with a willingness to go where the risk concentrates. Sergei offered to go with me. Misha insisted on covering us. We moved with tools and with the steady, focused panic of surgeons in a hospital after a bombing. The pump house was a small cathedral of mechanical grief. The motor lay like a broken heart in a metal cradle. The water in the intake stank of machine oil and bleach, and something sweet that made the back of the throat burn. I opened the control panel and found circuits like webs of misted copper, corroded and fused. The starter had a hairline fracture. The bearings were jammed with a slurry of grit. A thin film clung to everything like cataloged corrosion. There was a choice to make, a practical one and a moral one. We could try to fix the motor, which would buy time but not remove the toxins. The water, until tested, would still be suspect for heavy metals and solvents, or we could attempt a manual bypass, rig a temporary hand pump or a makeshift turbine that would float cleaner water off the upper stratum of the cistern. The bypass would yield much less water, but would avoid pulling the heavy contaminants that had settled. It required entering water that had been poisoned and working in it, hands submerged in a mixture that could eat the skin and mind alike. It required me to risk being contaminated, and perhaps carrying that contamination back into my community. We chose both. Sergei and I crawled into the gray slurry. The film clung to our sleeves and the taste of metal rose in my mouth. Misha stood at the door with a rifle and a look that asked no questions. The raiders scraped around the perimeter picking teeth like they were waiting to decide whether to storm or to bargain. Time moved like a film reel with missing frames. I waded to the intake and found the cap clogged with a mat of algae-soaked debris and a synthetic sponge-like mass that smelled of chemicals. My gloves, patched with duct tape, felt thin and useless. I had to cut and pry and shove until the intake groaned and began to allow flow. Sergei rigged a temporary flange of scrap and channeled water into a tube we could use as a siphon. We worked fast, fingers numb, lungs burning from the smell. Then the first shots came. They were not meant for us. They were meant to scare. A volley of bullets shattered the pump house's thin walls, and one struck the starter relay box where Sergei was leaning. Sparks arced like fireflies. Sergei cursed and grabbed for a handhold. A splinter embedded in his palm and blood mixed with the oily film. Misha fired back. The raiders, feeling the sting of return, hesitated. For a moment the world was just sound, the thump of jackets, the whine of the wind, the crack of distant guns. We flung a tarp over exposed circuitry, and I told Sergei to hand me the wrench. He moved with a speed that belonged to younger men, and to those who had been taught to keep their hands steady under pressure. Together, we turned a shaft and then another. We levered a plate until the bypass caught and water began to spill into a holding bladder we dragged from a truck. It was not much at first, a trickle that felt like mercy. But then the water picked up and like a proud animal began to flow. Kamenka cheered, a sound equal parts relief and disbelief. The raiders, seeing a drain of resolve where a fight could be had, pulled back a little. The leader, face gray with exhaustion and the grit of the day's wind, came into the pump house and placed her hand on my shoulder like the ritual of passing judgment and blessing at once. She told me in a voice that had the taste of a long fight that one of us would have to stay. She looked at Sergei and at me. I had been prepared for this, I had half known. My chest tightened like something being wound. I thought of home. I thought of the ledger of faces. I thought of Lena's fingers pulling thread through fabric and of Petrov's battery-counting joke. I thought of the child asleep with a palm on her mother's lap. Staying in Kamenka would mean leaving those faces, but it would also mean keeping open a tap that could keep them alive. I could walk back with a ration and fade into the ledger as a name, or I could remain as a living hinge between two places, a person who taught and did and bled for water in a place that had earned the right to survive. There was a sound then, a cough raw and unexpected. It was mine. The pump house's air, slick with volatile dust and solvent breath, had found me. My throat burned. My mouth tasted like pennies. My hands twitched as if trying to remember a safer time. Sergei looked at me and then at the leader. No words were necessary. It was a choice made in half a dozen glances and a ledger of what we could afford to risk. I stayed. We arranged it like a trade. Sergei would take the bulk rationed water back with the others and teach them the bypass rig. Kamenka would give us a monthly allotment for our people and spare parts on a schedule. I would become the liaison, a resident mechanic with a bed in the lower tower. The leader pressed a small tin of sugar into my palm and pinned a cloth to my chest that smelled faintly of dried lavender and something clean. "You keep the heart beating," she said. "We will keep the doors closed." That night the sky raged like a beast and the wind brought down the residues of the day's devastation. I slept in a small cot beneath a solar panel array, my body thrumming with a fatigue that felt like a map rewriting itself. My cough was worse in the dark. I thought, briefly and selfishly, of waking up in my own room with a cup of coffee that tasted like the city. But the next morning water flowed. Not enough to bathe, perhaps, but enough to boil and to treat, and enough that the child in the market could drink without fear. There was a cost. My skin grew splotchy where the solvent had touched it. Sometimes in the quiet hours I would taste metal at the back of my tongue and feel a softness in my thoughts that worried me. But there was also a shape of purpose I had not felt in months. To repair, to teach, to keep a machine that meant life from failing. Sergei came back often, and every visit he brought news and parts and a grin that was a little crooked. Lena came and taught the women to patch hoses. Petrov visited with jokes and batteries. The ledger of trust rearranged itself. Some people had lost me and had gained water. Some had given me a home in exchange for security. The climactic moment was not a single heroic act but a compact of choices. We had found the water. We had paid for it with labor and with sacrifice. I had chosen to remain, and in choosing, I had learned what it cost to be the hinge between a small town and a smaller caravan. The storm did not end the world, and neither did the raiders. But in the wash of aftermath, I learned that survival sometimes comes from staying in one place long enough to learn its language and to earn its trust. Later, when my cough turned into a slow fever, and I lay shivering beneath a blanket that stank faintly of machine oil, a child from the square slipped a hand into mine and squeezed. "Thank you," she whispered, and in that syllable was the whole economy of what we had traded: risk for continuing, knowledge for life, presence for water. I closed my eyes and let the weight of it be heavy and good. The turning point had been brutal and simple. Water, a pump, gunfire, a choice. The aftermath would be longer, threaded with slow repairs and teaching and days so ordinary they felt miraculous. I had stared at the ledger of faces and decided that my life could be spent making sure others woke up wet and fed. That was my reckoning. It was not a victory so much as an agreement to continue. In the heart of Kamenka, under the ring of windmills, the cistern finally held water that did not taste like ruin. I stayed, and in staying I found a reason to keep breathing. The first weeks after the pump house felt like living inside a slow inhale. Kamenka's victory, if it could be called that, was a long, gradual thing. A trickle becomes a stream becomes supply lines that do not snap at the first gust. We patched, taught, and documented until the work began to resemble something like ceremony. When Sergei returned to our town with the bulk ration we had negotiated, he brought back not just water but small miracles. A list of names who could repair bearings, a stack of spare gaskets, and a look on his face that said the world could be negotiated, at least in pieces. My decision to stay had a cost and a gift braided together. The cost was immediate and physical. The solvent that had ridden the runoff left a slow bruise on my lungs. I cough in the cold hours and wake to a metallic taste at the back of my tongue. My skin reacted in patches of blotches that would startle me in mirrors, and then fade like bad weather. There were times when my hands shook after a long day of tightening bolts and patching hoses. The clinic at Kamenka stitched what they could, dosed me with tea that smelled like rosemary, and assigned me a bunk near the generator so I could still hear its breathing at night. In quiet moments I would touch the small scar at the base of my thumb and remember the night the pump started to run again. There is a ledger of physical debts one collects here. Mine is written in coughs and a slow fatigue that does not leave at dawn. The gift, odd as it sounds, was steadiness. At Kamenka I woke to lists that mattered, who slept poorly, who needed clean bandages, which bearing had squealed and would fail by Tuesday if not greased. There was less improvisation and more routine. The community had rules born of necessity, watch rotations, shared maintenance schedules, an allotment calendar that everyone could see. People learned to read those calendars the way they once read newspapers. The dates on the chart were as important as weather reports. My name became something like a job title, mechanic, liaison, teacher. For a man who had been a runner and a radio voice, it was a strange reprieve to be needed for practical things. We rebuilt more than a pump. Lena's small patchwork of a greenhouse got reinforced with spare plastic and a ring of sandbags after that storm. She taught a group of women how to graft tomato seedlings onto hardier rootstock, and how to compost scraps so that the fragile soil around Kamenka would hold water longer. The first harvest, a few small red tomatoes and a handful of parsley, tasted like a story. People cried briefly and privately at the market when the tomatoes appeared on a saucer. It was not a feast by any historical measure, but it was a quiet insistence that life could be coaxed out of ruin. We set up workshops. I taught apprentices to splice wire and to identify bad capacitors. Lena taught someone to sew a filter bag that would catch particulates. A retired chemistry teacher who had survived with a stubbornness that looked like Faith taught villagers how to test water using simple strips and how to judge whether boiling was enough or a still was needed. Knowledge became currency, and importantly, it was shareable. When I went back with Sergei to my original town to teach the bypass rig, I left a notebook with diagrams penciled inside, a manual that someone could follow if I did not return. That perhaps was the largest change inside me. I began to think in permanence. Not permanence in the old, naive sense of expecting things to last forever, but permanence in the sense of investing in living structures that would outlast a single human lifespan, training, documentation, soil improvement. I learned to be patient with slow wins. When a child at the clinic learned to tie a knot properly and stop the bleeding of a skinned knee, it was a triumph that unfurled like a banner. Those small things sewn together made a life that could be measured in more than survival. But the aftermath was not a pastoral recovery. The rest of the world remained a jagged negotiation. Raids did not disappear, they evolved. The raiders who had tested Kamenka retreated after the pump house incident, but they receded like wolves who had tasted a fight and thought better of the menu. They shifted lanes, moving toward easier targets or banding with other groups. Supply routes remained dangerous. There were nights when the wind carried the distant sound of engines and the pallor of headlights like the ghost of a parade we could not afford to watch. Kamenka's success altered power dynamics in subtle ways. Where once we were a ragged congregation of survivors with no claim, now we were a node in a larger network. With that came politics. The Kamenka Council, a small, pragmatic group that had run the town since the first seasons of scarcity, had to make tough calls. Whom to admit, how to handle requests for help, how much to demand in return for water. The leader I had come to respect had a way of making decisions that felt surgical and necessary, but I began to see the strain on her. One wet season of plenty could not erase years of losses. People who came to Kamenka sometimes left more used than they arrived, and the ledger of favors and obligations stretched like a net that sometimes chafed. I worried, often at night, about the ethics of what we had done. Was Kamenka's water a common good or a commodity? Were we, by choosing to make the pump a guarded thing, planting a seed of inequality that might grow into a deeper fracture? I watched exchanges at the gate where men bartered labor for access and felt the tug of two worlds, one in which water is a right, and one in which water is security that must be protected. There are no neat answers here. The moment you declare a resource communal, you also make it vulnerable. The moment you guard it jealously, you harden it into currency others will covet. I tried to steer us toward transparency, public logs of who received what and why, because a ledger can be a tool against the arbitrary horde. Yet even logs can be burned, as we learned before. As seasons turned, small signs of recovery and of further deterioration sat side by side. The soil in Kamenka's catchment, bolstered by contour trenches and the stubborn compost we kept adding, began to hold more water. The grass at the edge of the cistern grew back in a fragile green ribbon. Birds returned, first as cautious dots on the horizon, and then as a chorus at dawn. These were not miracles but responses to careful human action. When erosion control held a slope through one violent rain, people applauded as if the earth had given them a deliberate gift. Elsewhere, the landscape continued to fracture. The hills beyond the levee still showed scars where tanks had churned up the ground and where chemicals had leached into hollows. I would go on rotation runs to inspect intake pipes and watch the land. Sometimes I returned with a pocket of soil that smelled faintly of burnt plastic, and my throat would tighten with a memory of the pump house that had nearly died. The environment was a patchwork of recovery and ongoing injury, a reminder that healing never happened evenly. There were moments of guilt that arrived without fanfare. When I heard a rumor that our old town had been hit by a convoy and that Lena's father had been among the missing, my chest filled with an old, familiar ache. I sent what I could: a barrel of water on a cart with 2 volunteers and a note written by hand. The volunteers returned with stories of checkpoints, and somebody named Petrov who had traded the last of his batteries for safe passage. The ledger of small human debts hummed in my head. I had chosen to trade my immediate presence for a steadier supply. That choice meant someone else might have to walk farther for water. We made trade-offs like this constantly: a ration here, a guard there, and each felt like both prudence and betrayal depending on who you asked. In the quieter hours, illness taught me humility. My cough settled into a constant companion. There were days when I could not lift a wrench without needing to sit down and breathe. A young medic at Kamenka, a woman who moved with efficient, gentle competence, put her hand to my chest and said, "You carried too much for too long." She prescribed rest and a regimen of herbal infusions and told me to restrict exposure to the intake. Restricting duty was almost impossible. The pump needed me. So I learned delegation. I taught apprentices to read wear patterns, to listen for a bearing that was about to fail, to smell the difference between a benign algae bloom and a solvent film. Delegation was a kind of survival reflex. Multiply competence so the system could breathe without any single person. After months, the community began to look at me differently. Where once they saw a temporary specialist, they began to see someone who had chosen to share their life with Kamenka. Children would run up and ask me to show them how a pipe joined to another, and the look on their faces when a wheel turned under their care was like sunlight. Petrov came by with jokes and batteries. Lena sent jars of pickles and sometimes a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. We formed new rituals: morning checks of the turbine bearings, the communal boiling of one large kettle for everyone at noon, a quiet song children sang when they carried water jugs so that the steps seemed lighter. These were small acts that stitched people to each other. The aftermath, in sum, was a complicated ledger. The pump continued to run because we chose to make running it a collective act rather than a private miracle. The raiders learned that Kamenka could bite back, and for a season our route to barter was more secure. Yet the larger systems that could shelter entire regions remained broken. The grid was still a dream. The river upstream still carried the risk of chemical washes, and the war that laced through our map continued to reorder possibilities. What changed inside me was a slow rearrangement of identity. I was no longer solely a runner or a voice on a radio. I had become an anchor of a sort, not immovable rock, but a person who chose to hold a place together because the place needed holding. That choice brought grief and reward in unequal measures. I had more responsibility, more weight in decisions that affected living people, and that burden trimmed the edges of my romanticism. Hope was no longer an airy thing to be recited into a transmitter. It had to be practical, measurable, and teachable. I learned to love not with sweeping declarations, but through fixing a bearing and watching a child drink clean water. I do not pretend the future looks idyllic. Storms still come with a speed that makes planning an act of faith. Supply lines can snap on a whim. The world beyond Kamenka still grooves with violence and climate injury. But the aftermath of the pump house taught me that the difference between surviving and living often hinges on small commitments. The copying of a manual, the patient training of an apprentice, the steady kindness of a woman who patches a tomato plant with her own hands. In the evenings, I sit on the low wall near the cistern and watch the water hold the light. It is not a mirror of a lost world. It is an honest pool in a place that learned to be careful around its beauty. Children splash at the edge when they can. Old men trade stories and batteries. I cough sometimes and taste metal, and the guilt of choices sits like a weight on my chest. Yet there are also times when I feel something like peace. The knowledge that I chose this shape of life, and that my small, weary decisions ripple through other people's mornings. Hope now is less a bright thing and more a practice. We train it, we ration it, we teach it to the young. It exists in the ledger, in the schedules, in the patched hoses and the transplanted seedlings. It is fragile, a wire that can be cut by greed or by neglect, but it is also survivable, because it rests on human habits repeated across days. I am still tired. I still carry my list of losses in my pocket, but when the wind comes up and the turbines return their soft, steady song, I remember why I stayed. Not because I wanted to be a hero, but because I could not bear the idea of returning and finding the cistern dry. I stayed to keep a tap open for people who had names and laughs and scars, and in doing so I found, piece by patched piece, a way to keep going. The nights are quieter now, but quieter in the way that follows a storm, the kind of quiet that tastes like grief and relief braided together. I lie in the bunk beneath the solar array and listen to the turbines sigh, a steady metronome that keeps the cistern from slipping back into rumor. Sometimes the sound steadies me so much I think I can measure my heart against it. Other times my cough reminds me that the price of getting here lives in my ribs. Hope is not a bright flare that bursts and then dies. It is a slow thing, a practice of showing up. I learned that in Kamenka, where patience and welding and 1,000 small kindnesses built a community that could hold water. We stitched repair manuals into a photocopied notebook and taught children to recognize the sound of a failing bearing. We rationed sugar. We argued about fairness and then burned the ledger when it began to feel like a weapon. We made mistakes and fixed them as best we could. People ask me if I feel like a victor. The answer is always the same: no. There are no tidy victories here. There are only choices you make because they are the least terrible. I chose to stay because the cistern was a hinge that could keep other doors from closing. I stayed because Lena's hands still knew how to graft a tomato, and because Petrov would not let me leave without a dozen bad jokes tucked into my pockets. I stayed because the child on the market bench needed someone to teach her how to tie a water rope without spilling her burden. Staying was a practice of small courage, not a heroic collapse into legend. The world outside Kamenka still presses with the same bluntness. Storms come that steal tarps and clog filters. Lanes get cut by fighting elsewhere and convoys are delayed. The raiders learned to look elsewhere for easy prey, but they did not vanish. Infrastructure remains a skeleton that the living must mend with whatever sinew is available. That is the truth we live with. Repair and resilience, not conquest. We mend bearings and teach others to mend them too. We plant contour trenches and graft seedlings. We build redundancy into our systems because we have learned to expect failure not as an exception, but as a rule. There are days when I feel the weight of the ledger more acutely. I miss my old town in ways that ache like hunger. I think of faces I will never see again, and of rooms that are now rubble. Sometimes I dream of walking down a street that is only light, of coffee that tastes like it used to, of a river that runs clean without a ritual. Those dreams are thin and precious. I do not show them freely because other people carry thicker losses, and their dreams wear heavy armor. On the practical level, we learn to turn hope into habit. We stockpiled charcoal for filters, taught each household to make a cloth ensemble filter that buys them safety for cloudy days, and installed hand pumps as backups where motors were vulnerable. We trained shift so no one person bore the entire burden of maintenance. Every time I teach someone to strip a corroded wire and solder a splice, I am grafting possibility into the future. That is the kind of hope that outlives a single human life because it is teachable, repeatable, and leaves traces in more than one head. Ethically, the choices sting. We had to define boundaries, who gets access and on what terms, and those boundaries bruise. Kamenka could not admit everyone who came to the gate without endangering itself. We had to be practical, and practicality is a species of cruelty sometimes. I still wrestle with that. There are nights when I imagine a different ledger where water is a right, not a commodity. I look at the children playing at the edge of the cistern, and I try to weigh what we have done against what we still owe. The work of surviving does not absolve us of responsibility. It complicates it. There is a small, fierce beauty in the routines we've built. Lena still tends the greenhouse with an almost religious patience. Petrov counts batteries and tells a joke that never lands but is always given. Sergei comes and goes with parts and news, and Misha teaches the children to duck when the winds pick up. We have rituals. The noon kettle where everyone gets a turn to take a sip and tell a short, true story. The morning check of turbine bearings. The ledger board that shows in black ink who did what the week before. Those routines are scaffolding for our souls. The future is not a single horizon. It is a route with many forks, some safer than others. We plan in increments. A month of fuel, a season of crops, a year of teaching apprentices who can carry the skills further. We work toward redundancy, multiple sources, multiple people who can fix what fails. We work toward transparency, public logs of how much water left the cistern and where it went, so that trust is not only a morning's mood but a documented habit. That is how communities survive the long attrition of scarcity, by turning generosity into procedure and compassion into a skill. My body tells me I am no longer the same man who walked out of my old town with only a radio and a backpack. Scars lace my hands and a cough writes itself into daily life. I am smaller sometimes, less certain, and more patient. My ambitions narrow down to things that matter in immediate terms. Teach the child to boil water correctly. Make sure the generator has oil. Keep the pump from seizing. Those are small prayers, but they are powerful ones. They keep people alive. If this message reaches someone beyond our valley on a crackled frequency or a hand-delivered note, then hear this plainly. Survival is not only about finding a source of water or roasting a field into obedience. Survival is about the boring arithmetic of care. It is about training a neighbor, writing down how-to steps, and baking a little extra bread for the person who cannot pay. It is about inventing redundancy, about sharing a manual and a wrench, about teaching children to be competent with their hands. It is about choosing, again and again, to be present where you are needed. So I sign off not with a flourish but with a small, stubborn request. Hold on to one another. Teach what you know. Keep the ledgers open. When you have extra, give it. When you have less, ask clearly and organize. Promise to return if you go out. Leave a note if you cannot. These things are not glamorous, but they are the architecture of continued life. Tonight the turbines sing like a promise that is slow and patient. The cistern holds its mirror, not of a past world, but of one that is being pieced together in moments. I am tired and my cough keeps time with the metronome. I think of Lena's hands, of Petrov's batteries, of Sergei's crooked grin. I think of the child who learned to tie a water rope without spilling a drop. I think of you, whoever is listening on some frequency, whoever is reading by flashlight, and I ask that you keep a small, practical faith. Stay alive. Stay human. Teach someone how to fix a pipe. Share your sugar. Write down the steps you take when a pump dies. That is how the future is made here, not in triumphant proclamations, but in 1,000 small acts repeated until habit becomes survival. I will keep the pump running as long as my hands allow and as long as the community needs me. If I must stop, I will leave instructions and a name of someone who can take my place. This is not an ending. It is a promise to continue, to breathe, to teach, to grieve, and to keep making things that matter. The world is not healed. It is being mended slowly and stubbornly, one repair at a time.